NATO is in shock. How could Ukraine betray us like this? And this is, moreover, the highest form of betrayal. Because according to several reports from very reliable sources, Ukraine has allegedly been selling to the highest bidder, not just advanced technology, but also the actual production plans for the North Atlantic Alliance's most secret weapons. One of the countries most affected here would undoubtedly be the United Kingdom. In NATO, they still can't believe it. We gave them absolutely everything, and this is how they repay us. Besides this, of course, they can hardly say anything because of the huge scandal it would cause, but that's what we're here for. NATO weapons sold by Ukraine. To whom and for what reason? What consequences will all of this have? We're going to look at all of this in detail in this report. And stay until the end of this video, because there I'll explain what Israel, the Russian Federation, and maybe even China have to do with all of this. I'm Liu Sivaya, a war correspondent in Donbass and geopolitical analyst. Subscribe to this channel to stay up to date with the latest international news and, of course, the very latest updates on the Ukrainian conflict. Let's begin. We start, as usual, from the beginning to explain how Ukraine may have been selling this weaponry directly from the North Atlantic Alliance, or to be redundant, to the highest bidder. The key point here would be, where is this highest bidder and what threat does he pose? Therefore, would this sale be for the whole world or perhaps for certain specific countries? But for all this, we need to explain at the beginning what kind of weaponry we're talking about. What does it have to do with Ukraine? And a bit of the background on how one of the countries most supported by NATO ended up here. Of course, for and by their own interests, but in the end, supposedly in an absolutely kind and selfless way, ultimately betraying the alliance like this. The first point here is that we need to look at the weaponry itself. Do you remember those Star missiles that Ukraine supposedly ended up deploying? The ones with which Volodymyr Zelensky directly threatened Moscow? He said that even the capital of the Russian Federation would be left without power because the Flamingo missiles produced directly in Ukraine would fly there en masse. Basically, it was the alliance of desperation. Desperation, desperation, desperation. Don't be so dramatic. I know that I know. Well, it was actually the British missile FP-5 Millennium, which indeed served as a prototype for this Ukrainian superweapon. Oh my God, so they just took the British missile and put a Made in Ukraine label on it. Well, actually, not exactly like that, because that missile that Ukraine apparently did launch against the territory of the Russian Federation ended up falling apart. It turned out it was basically made of crap and sticks. Not said by me, but by several analysts, including Ukrainian analysts, such as the Ukrainian blogger Anatoly Sari. So many analysts, mistakenly in my opinion, instead of having a minimum of critical thinking, started laughing at Ukraine. But if this actually has washing machine microchips, if they were laughing at Russia, then where are they going to end up launching? But actually, the key issue here was the fact that Ukraine apparently managed to lower the price. In an absolutely incredible way, they turned the initial British FP-5 Millennium missile into the Ukrainian Flamingo missile, which was indeed made from the simplest materials. But in the end, thanks to that, it ended up costing about $20,000. And yes, indeed, it could be that by lowering the price so much, it wasn't the best or the most accurate missile. But then, analyzing the issue, we pointed out that the key point, redundantly, would be the quantity. I mean, since we're talking about missiles that are extremely cheap, if they were mass-produced by the Ukrainian side, or rather by NATO, they could indeed pose a problem for the Russian Federation, and maybe even a very serious one. However, like almost everything in Ukraine, especially lately, anything that involves even a minimal amount of Western investment ends up attracting huge amounts of corruption. Oh my God. It turns out that this has also affected the Flamingo missile, so now its production is stopped due to a lack of investment. Because the Western partners, who are precisely the ones who have to invest, simply don't trust that the money given to Ukraine will actually go toward missile production. Come on, as if they didn't know something about it. But the truth is that now they have all the evidence. Or at least they can't keep sending money to Ukraine. When the entirety, practically, of the ordinary Western population, who are ultimately the ones paying for the party, both for the Ukrainian politicians and, of course, for the Western politicians, already knows exactly what's going on. Well, in Ukraine, one of the biggest corruption scandals has just broken out, directly involving even Vladimir Zelensky's number two, Mr. Yermak, who has already been dismissed from his position, as well as the money man of that same Vladimir Zelensky. Mr. Mindich, Timur Mindich, one of Vladimir Zelensky's main partners, co-founder of Kvartal 95, which is precisely this company, initially a film company, where an actor started who later ended up becoming a president. And above all, Timur Mindich, owner of one of the important, because Ukraine is very, very important. Ukraine police is very important because the police of Ukraine, very important. Police because Ukraine police of Ukraine is very, Ukraine police because the Ukraine police, because the Ukraine police, because the police of Ukraine is very, because the Ukraine police, very important, because the police of Ukraine is very important. Both from Timur Mindich, who is currently on the run from Ukraine, because the cases of corruption have turned out to be stronger than the very administration of the Kiev regime, which until now had been quite successfully covering up for one of Vladimir Zelensky's main associates. Firepoint, therefore, has been called into question, and with it, the production of Ukrainian weaponry, which was supposed to be eradicated in principle, on one hand in Ukraine and on the other in Denmark. This is explained by the fact that Ukraine's energy infrastructure is being increasingly damaged, and it is being increasingly damaged by the constant massive attacks carried out by the Russian Federation. In addition, Ukraine actually doesn't have enough money. These warehouses and these production plants would be at risk in that country, so indeed, a part could be produced in Ukraine. But a third country would have to be found, if not another Western partner. And precisely because of that, Volodymyr Zelensky was traveling all over Europe, finding his arms paradise directly in Denmark, which not only provided the production plants, but also seems to have put in a significant amount of money. Of course, the money committed by Denmark is certainly not nearly enough to produce this new Ukrainian missile, Flamingo, at least not to produce it in large quantities. Not for the Ukrainian economy. However, the investments from other Western partners, which were pretty much agreed upon, ended up being called into question. Because Timur Minsk, one of the founders, one of the key partners of the company in question, is no longer in Ukraine. He is under very serious suspicion of a tremendous and enormous amount of corruption hanging right over his head. So who would want to risk their money in an economy that already seems so shady from the start? Well, here we have to specifically mention the case of Germany because the answer is indeed no one except Germany and maybe Denmark. But if Denmark has already signed some agreements that don't allow it to quickly leave the equation, Germany could do the same thing that the rest of the North Atlantic Alliance partners have already done. But for some reason, Germany is willing not only to pay, but almost to deceive by giving Ukraine long-range missiles.
In recent months, we have been working intensively with the Ukrainian government to implement projects for long-range fire. As we say technically, the Ukrainian army will be equipped with such weapon systems.
Here, I think any kind of comment is unnecessary. The German case is really something else entirely. Be that as it may, if there is no money from NATO, the money has to come from somewhere else. And not just to produce the Flamingo missile, but also to cover possible expenses and debts of Timur Mindich. Or it could also concern the sale of that gentleman's assets. Once he actually knows and understands that he won't be able to keep using them to continue enriching himself at their expense. And this is where we receive one of the key pieces of information in this whole matter. In Habla, a politician, formerly Ukrainian and now belonging to the Russian Federation, a deputy of the Rada, at that time, whose father was one of the high-ranking officers of the Security Service of Ukraine, he himself was also in Security Service of Ukraine officer, that is, from the National Security of Ukraine, Andriy Yerkache. And he literally says the following. And also, just a week ago, the Danes found out that the private company Firepoint sold weapon production technologies along with a stake in the company to Arab investors without any notice. The surprised Fredriksons, that's how he jokingly refers to the Danes, are trying to avoid reputational losses since Denmark injected 500 million kroner. Did Zelensky push for Firepoint to enter the intergovernmental agreement for the production of Flamingo missiles and drones, creating with the Mindich-Zelensky mess a threat to security? Yes, that's exactly how we get to one of the key points of this whole matter. Andriy Yerkache, let me tell you that besides being a former deputy of the Ukrainian Rada, he is a man who still to this day has many contacts in Ukraine. That is to say, he is probably one of those who knows the most and understands best all the tricks of the Kiev regime. And well, in fact, he could be indirectly connected to the Mindich case. He has been publishing a lot of information. That is to say, we are talking about an extremely reliable source. And the information he's revealing, all of this should be an international scandal of biblical proportions, at the very least within the North Atlantic Alliance, because in fact, it would represent one of the most serious threats to their security almost in their entire history. I repeat, we're talking about British technology, that is the Ukrainian missile that the Ukrainian side, or directly Timur Mindich, would be selling to Arab investors. Who knows which countries they would end up coming from, as well as shares, a sort of participation in his company, Firepoint. Is he really putting NATO in check because the Arabs aren't really getting access to Ukraine's cutting-edge technology? Partially. Yes, we'll see that now. But first of all, they get access to the FP5 Kamalanian missile, which is British-made, among others, and a lot of technology that we actually know very little about right now. I mean, the same country that all this time has been receiving all kinds of military and economic aid from NATO. In short, I repeat, of all kinds and sizes, it would have been directly selling the heart, the inner workings of the alliance. And that's not all. The key point is to whom they would have been selling it. And also cutting-edge technology, what kind of features? Here we are reminded again that the Ukrainian Flamingo missile was initially intended to be an infinitely cheaper copy of the British-made FP5. That is, a missile that cost only about $20,000. An absolute madness perfectly suited to the Arab arms market, especially if we think, for example, of the Middle East. That is, who could make the best use of it? Not Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iran, all these countries that currently have many points of conflict, for example, with Israel. But could we say directly against the West? Here we should especially mention the United States, who would end up receiving it. Not only British technology, but also the way Ukrainian scientists have already thought of to perfectly adapt it to their reality, spending little and attacking a lot. And yes, indeed, Israel could be one of the most affected, but actually it might not be. And here we must remember another very recent case where practically all of the West has been involved, but especially the United States and, once again, Israel, about a bomb that I actually mentioned in a short, and we laughed quite a bit about it. But the matter is no joke. It's about the guided bomb unit, 39 bomb made in the United States, which that country supposedly delivered to Israel. Israel, in one of its many acts of warmongering, decided to use precisely this weapon to end up attacking Lebanese territory with it. But, well, it turns out that the bomb, once it arrived in Beirut, simply didn't explode. Bad luck, yes, but it's unclear for whom, especially the American side, which is the most inconceivable part of this. Now they're asking for it back to Lebanon so it doesn't end up in the hands of their worst enemies, asking the Russian Federation and, above all, China. Applying this case to the one we're dealing with in this report, that is the case of the Flamingo missiles, and therefore the British FP5 Millennium missiles, we should ask ourselves if something similar could happen again. That is, once this technology is actually in the hands of Arab investors, which seems unpleasant, it has already happened. It doesn't end up in Russia, China, or any other country, which without a doubt would end up greatly harming NATO. And not only that, even though NATO is now trying to get the weapons themselves back. Or they could even try to pressure the Arabs to get rid of their shares in Firepoint. But who could guarantee that the Arabs haven't already dismantled the missile in question, piece by piece? They might have already sold the technology, or given it away, or traded the technology for anything else that might interest them from any of the countries, who in turn would be interested in harming NATO in any way or simply confronting NATO. Surprisingly, due to Ukraine's unexpected and treacherous help, will NATO end or not? Receiving that cutting edge technology back, it will end up more or less harmed by this trick that has just come directly from the Kiev regime. Wow, Ukraine, who would have thought? It ended up betraying those who have been helping it the most. But of course, in defense, who would have thought? Me defending the Ukrainian side, but in the end, in defense of the Ukrainian side? I have to say that NATO has also been investing in Ukraine. Not exactly to help the country, but to defend its own interests. Waging war against the Russian Federation and weakening that country by any means. I mean, that's the cause and effect. But what is absolutely clear now is that they are in complete shock. They are going to do everything possible to cover up this information, simply because I imagine it's absolutely obvious, so it can't come out or appear in the major media outlets. So, this is exactly where I want to thank you for making our work possible with your support and your help. Because it's precisely thanks to you that this information ends up coming out. The truth, therefore, ends up opening that path. And a multipolar world that is a world that is truly much better and much fairer is getting closer and closer.